A lot of people don't actually understand how IP, why it's relevant to them, how it impacts their lives, how it touches their lives.
There's really been some shocking developments in the intellectual property economy over the past 40 years. We're talking over $70 trillion worth of estimated value in the global economy that sits on these balance sheets now of the 500 largest companies.
Would it be fair to say that the intellectual property system as it exists currently is not serving the collective benefit as it should?
I encourage the criticism of the system in this way as a patent lawyer who feels responsible to try and make it better, because I think we can do so much better. It has served amazing things for what it is.
There's a famous quote from Elon Musk, which is that a patent is just a lottery ticket for a lawsuit. What's your end game if you have a patented innovation and you want to protect it? Your end game is a lawsuit.
40 years ago, only 20% of the balance sheet of any large tech company, including high tech, would be in IP. Now it's inverted. Now it's about 80%.
But hello and welcome. Thanks for coming to the DeSci podcast. Today we're going to be talking about IP as cultural infrastructure. And so we brought two of Molecule's lawyers who are both very foundational in sort of mapping out and defining how Molecule thinks about IP and why we've designed the primitives that we have around IP. So yeah, Jesse and Chris, I'd love you to introduce yourself.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And it's so fun to join each of these and to get to chat with Jesse again, as we often do, but in this context is a real pleasure. Yes, I'm Chris Burns. I'm an intellectual property lawyer. I've worked across all different types of intellectual property, and I'm a registered patent attorney and litigator, as well as copyright and trademark attorney. And really excited to get to chat with Jesse about these builds and everything.
It's great to chat with you again, Chris. I think the last podcast we did, we had a lot of fun in within this context as well, and we've been working together for years now on IP tokenization within the molecule and the bio ecosystem. I'm Jesse. I'm also an attorney. I have been working with Molecule since the very beginning, since it was focused on initially fundraising for a mushroom microdosing project to the University of Toronto. Prior to becoming an attorney, I was an anthropologist, as well as worked as GP at a venture capital firm, investing in psychedelics, co-founded by one of the co-founders of Polychain Capital, a Web3 firm. And in Molecule, where I serve as chief legal architect, I focus on the architecture of our IP NFT and our IP tokenization protocol. So super stoked to be here. Thank you, Ella, for having us, and can't wait to talk about IP more.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's the intro into our first sort of topic. Is that, like, I think not many people would want to talk about IP so enthusiastically, and I think it's because a lot of people don't actually understand like how IP, why it's relevant to them, how it impacts their lives, how it touches their lives. I know, like, for sure, I could help, deal with like I could help understand a little bit better, why IP should be important to like an individual outside of like businesses wanting to, mark their ownership on ideas.
Yeah. I mean, one of there's really been some shocking developments in the intellectual property economy over the past 40 years that many of us have all lived through and partaken in, and watched how it impacts our salaries and watch how it impacts consumer prices of everything that we consume. But we've done so really without being very active agents in how this cultural transformation has actually come to bear in the market so far. And for reasons, I think we can keep talking about today, I think Web3 is so exciting, and tokenization of IP is so exciting because it all of a sudden allows us a means to get active with what's happening. But this big seismic shift that I'm describing is best sort of encaptured by a stat that the World Intellectual Property Organization puts out. And this is an organization that is run through the United Nations apparatus and is tasked with administering, really trying to help administer the harmonization of international IP rules, which have largely been codified through the World Trade Organization and the trade related aspects on intellectual property, which came into effect in 1994, but has since also been further codified through any international trade agreement or bilateral investment treaty that any country in the world has entered into in the past 40 years. They all have strong IP provisions. Now, why does that matter again? We're talking over $70 trillion worth of estimated value on in the global economy that sits on these balance sheets now of the 500 largest companies. What this really has means is that we've seen what one can think of as kind of an IPification of the global economy. Whereas 40 years ago, only 20% of the balance sheet of a large modern tech company, or really any large tech company, including high tech, would be in IP and in kind of intangible assets. Now it's inverted. Now it's about 80%. So then the question becomes, wow, we have so much value locked up in here, and who then is making it, and how has it become locked up in the way it has? And perhaps even the more interesting question is, how can we unlock and sort of better develop the power of all of this IP and this value, for public good? But that this shift from what even estimates, I'd say 70 plus trillion, these numbers are very fluid for plenty of good reasons, but an estimate from 40 years ago, I would probably put the IP, total global value at under $1 trillion, I think. So we've seen over a 70x in full growth. It's something totally radically uncorrelated to just normal economic growth, which is probably worth mentioning as well. But I'd love
And
to hear, Jesse, what got you excited about this?
well, what it mirrors to me is the adoption of digital technology and the adoption of the internet, and the migration of our culture in the terms of like Marshall McLuhan from one media, print media, to electronic media. And the more that our culture migrates from print to electronic as the main medium of communication, the more IP, intangible property, intellectual property comes online and gets created and gets value. For example, if you look back at the past few decades, data has kind of become the new oil, and data is under this umbrella of IP, right? And the cool thing about IP is that just like data, just like electronic, information, it's far more scalable than real property. Because the law has these kind of two broad definitions in the U.S. You have real property, which is like physical goods, your house, your farm, and that's pretty hard to develop and maintain. It's valuable, but it's not necessarily super scalable. And then you have intellectual property, which is intangible, it's virtual, it can exist in a computer drive or it can exist online, and that's much more scalable. And in many cases, it's much more valuable than real property. You can have a company that has an IP portfolio worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. Think about a pharma company. And their real property portfolio, their manufacturing facilities or their laboratories or their offices, is worth a small fraction of that. So to me, the growth of IP, it mirrors the growth of the digital economy. And intellectual property is a perfect match for what crypto is, because what crypto does is it enables the security of these digital assets in a way that wasn't really possible before, through distributed ledgers. And so to me, that's a really interesting trend to identify, that the growth of IP, it mirrors and it goes in tandem with the growth of the internet and the growth of this new medium through which we're transmitting information, we're operating as a society. But Ella's question was about also like, what does it mean for the individual? Is that right, Ella?
Yeah. I think it's like in my day-to-day life, I think I don't ever consider how intellectual property like matters to me. It touches my life. But I think having worked at Molecule longer and longer, I think you start to see it and it starts to crop up. And so I think it's just like for people to like what would help people understand
Yeah.
how integral it is that we should care about intellectual property and should educate ourselves on it.
Yeah. One great way is talking about personal brand. There's one concept in IP, which is your name and likeness, your name, image, and likeness, which is big right now in football, college football, because college football players aren't allowed to be paid necessarily for being players, even though the NCAA gets paid a ton of money for for having these games. They're pulling in a ton of revenue. The college athletes aren't seeing that revenue or weren't previously, but now they are allowed to under this framework of NIL, name, image, and likeness rights. And what's your name, image, and likeness? That's your intellectual property as an individual, as a person. And so if you think about now in the online economy where a lot of people are building personal brands on Twitter or on Instagram or whatever, their name, image, and likeness is their IP, and it becomes immediately relevant to their daily lives.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and maybe it's helpful. I think further to parse out the three types of IP that we generally talk about when we lump together intellectual property. There's this name, image, and likeness fits. It's kind of a blend. It's predominantly in the trademark realm, but it also has some copyright. Um, Corollaries, which is often the case, like with any trademark. Trademarks are fundamentally about consumer protection and arose as a means to try and protect consumers in ensuring that they were getting an authentic um, origin of that what they were getting actually comes from where it said, and you can then hold supply chains accountable and people accountable. In fact, an interesting story about how trademarks actually came to arise was in medieval Europe. I think this was in England. People would go and buy bread, and you'd buy a loaf of bread, for a shilling or whatever it might cost. But then you might get home and realize that the bread's bad on the inside, or there's stones in it, or there's some problem with it. Well, then you would go back to the baker and try and protest, and say, "You're selling me bad bread." And how would you know? They said, "Well, we didn't sell you that loaf of bread. You could have gotten that from anywhere." And so it was actually by royal decree that bakers had to put a brand on their bread so that when you could go home, you had a proof that would actually protect you, in being able to go back and say, "Hey, they're cheating on the bread." So this logic is also very different from how the trademark economy works now, which is much more about saying, well, this is about mine and making sure no one
Mm.
copies off of me. But there are two sides of the same coin. And one has to kind of work and express and cultivate and curate a brand, a name, image, or likeness in order to develop it into something that is a real IP asset. This is different in some ways from copyright. So, copyright as a separate category of intellectual property is what applies to protect any form of creative expression that a conscious being creates. But it's simply
Mm.
the actual form of what is uh, created that is protected in the first instance with copyright. The first logic of copyright is to say, if I draw a star on a piece of paper, that star is my copyright protection. Now, that doesn't mean I can exclude other people from drawing stars the exact same way. That would be a patent if it were patentable subject matter. But copyright also has expanded. So this applies automatically too. And this is the only intellectual property right. I mean, well, at least separate from patents. Trademarks, again, it always gets a little complicated because it doesn't fit so neatly in the patent copyright sort of logic as well. But um, you don't have to register anything. You don't have to tell the government that you've made this creative work in any way, copyright automatically applies, thanks to international law. And it has also expanded now, though, to where copyright does go beyond just the mere words, to where it can protect characters as well. And you'll see with Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling is somewhat of a notorious for enforcing copyright over Harry Potter against even fan fiction. So you think, well, if there's this character Harry Potter, but now I'm going to take Harry Potter in a totally
Mhm.
different direction and write something that is utterly original and new. I'm simply using the name. Um, Copyright can block that,
Hmm.
for for better or worse. That's
Yeah.
it's pushing towards the maximum side. And now the
Would
third
you?
and last one, yeah, I'll just add patents real quick. Patents are what inventors make for inventions, and these end up being the most powerful in the economy because they do allow you to exclude the abstraction even more than a derivative work or the evolution of a character like Harry Potter. This says I have a right to exclude anyone inside the jurisdiction where I own this patent from performing a method for
Mhm.
treating depression with a certain molecule, or something like this. Wow, now that's really powerful. For reasons we can also talk about later, patents are the most expensive and also create a host of both problems and opportunities in the patent system that we've also addressed, I think, in some other
Mm.
podcasts. But those three buckets are the three hats we wear. And so if you're we like to think of ourselves, I think, too, and we're quickly moving in the decentralized science space to where I imagine everyone can be an inventor on a patent. I'm an inventor on a patent. Patent claims are what matter, and you can get a narrow claim. And I think there's cultural value too to having people understand themselves and saying, I am a creator, I'm an inventor, I'm an artist, I am myself, and I should feel confident and empowered in a system that allows me to inhabit this role, which I think we do look upon with some respect, still. The
Mhm.
inventor, the artist. We
Hmm.
we know their social value, and we can get into now tokenization really again starts to unlock where that goes. But wanted to just add those buckets, and I'll stop talking.
No, that's super helpful. I think what like I would love to like know is that so patents are sort of the economy aspect of intellectual property. That's where sort of the real money churns. Um, is that correct?
Sometimes,
Is that correct?
sometimes not necessarily. Like
Okay.
you
Yeah.
could take your trademark portfolio and you can collateralize that for real money. For example, during the airplane crises, during COVID, some of the major U.S. airlines they took their trademark portfolios, their brand equity, you can call it, like the American Airlines
Mhm.
brand, and they actually got loans against those brand assets as collateral.
That's insane.
Yeah.
That's insane.
So those
And
aren't patents, right? Those are just their
Mhm.
copyrights and their trademarks, and they're saying we're getting a loan of 40, 50, $60 million against that brand equity.
yeah, yeah, the brands sit into the billions, on balance sheets for big brands. Copyright as well. Video games are really nothing but copyright if we were to
Yep.
map
Mhm.
that into IP parlance. And a good video game is a billion-dollar enterprise,
Yeah.
much like the most valuable that we tend to think of patents being either pharmaceutical drugs or some standard essential Wi-Fi patents, things like this can also hit into the billion-dollar mark.
Uh-huh. So they're all
It's
economic objects.
Okay.
yeah, they're all economic objects. They behave differently, but if you had to break them down just by discrete asset, you would say the patent itself is the one that, generally speaking, has a floor price of whatever you have to pay for it, which is normally like at least 10 grand. And these other ones can be much, much smaller. So obviously my
Hmm.
etched star, isn't $1 billion. And I can't really get a patent that is as weak or as cheap. Unless I get a patent that should have never been issued, then
Yeah.
it's actually something
Yeah.
that's worthless that I wield. But
Yeah. And then I mean, so most people say, for example, there is a patent, someone needs to use that piece of technology or whatever, they would just license the patent
So
from the patent holder. And I think what I wanted to ask about that question is, what are the rules around licensing? I mean, can someone really just say, I want to make it whatever price I want, or I don't want to patent, license it? And I mean, what if you get a bad actor who, really just wants to withhold information? Is that just kind of par for the course?
yes, yes. Unfortunately, this takes us into the heart of why we have the problem that one problem I'm very interested in trying to solve with IP as culture, and this comes in the form of patent trolls. Copyright trolls can exist as well, but the model is most known through the patent troll model, and what happens is that. And there's no shop where you go, you have to enforce your patent if you want someone to take a license, which means you have to spend an exorbitant amount of time and money trying to understand what your competitors are doing, to see if they actually infringe your patent. And the cost of this economy, the enforcement economy itself, is so high that it's cost prohibitive for small entities with IP to often enforce. And so, on one side, we have a situation where it's known as efficient infringement. If you're a really large company and you can fight in court if someone you can afford $1 million if someone's going to accuse you of patent infringement, you may as well just go full steam ahead, not even really look at the market out there and worry about what patents are there and just build blind and towards what the market needs. Because you also can never really know if you're infringing every patent. You can't get full, complete freedom to operate. You ask lawyers to help you discern that, but like risk, there's always risk. And this also is compounded by the fact that we have a patent quality problem globally, for a lot of reasons that are challenging to solve for. But the gist of it is that a patent examiner may only have 10 hours or so to review a patent application, and this examiner may have a PhD, maybe a master's of some science that they're looking at, but the breadth and depth that we've gone as an innovative economy is such that you would need specialists and teams of specialists to actually understand if something is innovative at the
Mm-hmm.
level of being worthy of a patent claim that's being granted, in a way that is very difficult to scale inside the legacy system. Now, if we could have something like a DAO,
Yeah.
now we can talk about other ways in which we can do better. But what happens ultimately is you end up with an economy that has emerged that's, not sort of the bad side of it also calls them patent trolls, where someone will buy up a bad patent and then might sue 20 different companies in a single market and say, look, my patent might not be that great. Maybe it's invalid. I doubt you infringe it if I actually had claim. When we decide, that this broadly worded claim means something more narrow, but for you to settle with me and to get this license or to just get this case to go away, if you want to litigate it, you're going to be paying at least 500,000, a million on up. So a patent troll will come and sue you and on day one say, all right, give me 100 grand and I'll walk away right now. And you think, 100 grand, that's crazy. This patent's invalid and I don't infringe. Okay, well then go ask your lawyers what will it cost to prove this and what are the chances that you prevail and all these things, to where there's an economically rational decision to be made where you begin to buy licenses just to clear risk rather than to fight out whether or not there's justice being had and whether you actually need the license. This is such a problem that 80% of all patent litigation in the United States, I believe it's somewhere around 80% last year, was filed by patent trolls. And I think something on the order of half of all litigation in the United States last year was patent litigation. So you're talking about nearly 40% or some just extremely high volume of litigation chewing up taxpayer, judicial
Mm.
court resources are going to just feed a market of patent litigation as a means to push people into settlements that aren't really connected to the merits of the patents themselves. This break unlocks all types of problems in terms of disaggregated markets and irrational decisions on how money's spent for the value of an asset where you need to get it valuable in one vein, but then when it's monetized from a completely different value proposition. These types of market failures and inefficiencies are just full across the global IP economy. And
Mm.
it's also the cultural context in now which we're introducing tokenization and some really cool tools.
Cool. I think like to pull out a little bit, I think like I mean, so you kind of touched on some of the issues that the patent system has, and I think if you go, if I'm thinking about it, if I boil down really to the root of it, intellectual property kind of came from a need for someone, I've had an idea, I would like to say that this is my idea, and I would like to reap some financial reward from having my idea and having worked on it. Um, and kind of, I mean, we've touched on these issues of the sort of the top 500 companies in the world, own however many trillions of intellectual property or patents. And um, Chris, you were just mentioning how sort of small business owners are targeted by patent trolls. And so I think, I mean, would it be fair to say that the patent or the intellectual property system as it exists currently is not serving the collective benefit as it should?
I I certainly I certainly think that's a fair. I encourage the criticism of the system in this way as a patent lawyer who feels responsible to try and make it better because I think we can do so much better. It has served. It's done amazing things for for what it is. It's a tool. It's a powerful tool, and like any tool, it can be used to do great things. Even a broken hammer, repaired right, can still build a really nice house. Doesn't mean we with a better hammer or maybe with a completely new tool set, we couldn't be building even greater houses. And so I'd maybe put it in a double positive way, but the shortcomings from where we are to where we can go, and especially with the potential that we've now unlocked with tokenization, I think, yeah, I'd say it's fair to say, yeah, it's not doing as well, nearly as well as what we deserve.
Jesse, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that Tesla open sourced its patents for a reason, right? To foster innovation. And there's a famous quote from Elon Musk, which is that a, a patent is just a lottery ticket for a lawsuit, which is like interesting to think about. That like, what's your end game if you have a patented innovation and you want to protect it? Your end game is a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And so if your objective is actually to accelerate innovation as much as possible, for
Mm.
example, in the electric car industry, the correct move is not to actually aggressively protect your IP, it's to share it.
And notably though, what Tesla didn't do was open up its patent portfolio on the car. What it did, I think, unless it's also shifted,
On the
but when it
engines.
first came out, it was to open up the patent portfolio on the charging networks. And this also gets to a very sophisticated and important point about how market power works with intellectual property, where if you're Tesla and you own all of the IP around the car and the most advanced technology for charging, well, you're consider yourself a natural monopolist where your patents are helping to protect and wield that market power, but you can't grow quickly then because
Mm.
you've created such a high barrier to entry that nobody wants to build
Yeah.
your charging your grid,
And
right?
more chargers means more people want to buy the best chargeable car, which is going to be your
Exactly. So
Tesla.
so you try and make the network completely free to access by decreasing barriers to entry in encouraging third-party competition and a competitive market in the charging
Mm.
network grid, which will allow the grid and then the range of the car to now go international or, as far as you want. But you keep the car itself or the thing that you find most valuable closed source. And this is essentially the same play that you can see open source software do with, say, Android technology, right? Google decided to open source Android as an operating system, which in many ways is the electric charging operating system network you need for Tesla to work. And we do this in software with operating systems. You make an open source one, but you can then build closed source applications on top of the open source operating
Mm-hmm.
system, and you
Mm.
use those closed source logic, be it with closed source code, IP, or sometimes you can even use open source, but you know that the open source needs servicing. So what's closed source is what is really a know-how
Mm.
IP that you use by then charging hourly to service, the application of one open source system to another.
Mm-hmm.
But these things I think become really smart, and I think they also get to some interesting things we're seeing with tokenization and DAOs, and how they think of themselves. And Jesse and I have had the privilege of working across several of the bio DAOs. We first connected and met in Vita DAO, working on essentially the precursor to the IPT, but we were really interested in, again, capturing an ethical right to licensing to make sure we're non-discriminatory and really open, to achieve the things, Ella, you were describing, of be
Mm.
good players in the space. And that's good. And VitaDAO's approach to how it wields tokens and what it's building, has one thesis. SideDAO is another DAO that Jesse and I both co helped to initiate. And SideDAO, we have seen what the other bio DAOs are doing, but then really started to think a lot about these network effect ideas and say, you know what, if what we really want to do, in addition to sort of building what can look sometimes more almost like decentralized VC work, cool and great value proposition one angle, different from let's build a token network of IP that's connected to this psychedelic, science and art inside out. But if we onboard a community into a network of tokens, the whole way we monetize and develop ourselves as a community and treat IP culturally is fundamentally different, because it's really the value around which we're organizing and floating our community together, rather than something where we're a community whose value is being organized around, uh, maybe ETH and USDC, and then we're going to buy and acquire and invest in out network IP and kind of then curate it, but be a service provider that ships IP along, or be a network that becomes the IP, and then grows more in this kind of dog foody cooperative sort of style way. And one
Mm-hmm.
last bit I'll add there, because it picks up on, I think, Jesse's really good points about saying, look at data, look at oil, look at how the information economy over time has evolved. How can we map this into the IPification of things? And I think we see. Sorry, I totally just lost where I was going with that. So,
It's kind of like everything is computer.
yeah, exactly. Oh, I know what. Yeah, I wanted to add. There's some really great. There's a really great book, that a law professor named Tim Wu wrote. This probably came out around 20 years ago, maybe, called "The Master Switch: The Rise and Fall of Information Empires," and it's a great read in through the U.S. lens of looking at how information empires, including IP, have evolved, and you see from radio, into telephone, into the internet, and so Web one, Web two. Um, what I think we see with Web three now is something that we're going to be grappling with. We're at the beginning of this, and there's a lot of the utopia that I think we
Mm.
share, that people also shared in the early, really kind of Web one days, before there was centralization. And I think we're going to have to look specifically at how intellectual property and market power and these games along the lines of what we were just describing with Tesla are how those can be played when we actually think about our new internet being
Mm.
the not just the transmission of data, but the transmission of IP. And with 3D printers, that can even just mean innovation itself in a more somehow even more multi-dimensional sense. But I think everyone kind of knows where that goes. But this, I think, it becomes really exciting too. We're building beyond an information network. We're building an intellectual property network, and that difference, I think, in while losing some language, I think we'll need to come up with better language for it. I think it is this active human cultural component and the
Mm-hmm.
ethics that we put in as creators into this that is what makes the difference between information and IP. And this, I think,
Yep.
too, is where we're inviting all types of cool experimentation for expressing autonomously and individually our new IP ethics, our own terms of creation. What are the
Mm-hmm.
terms upon which I want my IP and information to be used and commercialized? Rather than just
Yep.
assigning it into a network where people can take it and run with it, I'll assign it to a network where people can take it and run with it and run with me with it along with my ideas of saying, I don't want my invention to be used to hurt people or something. Well, I might have to actively get out there and make sure people don't use it to hurt people then. But now we
Yep.
can, again, can.
Like for example, the Tesla open sourcing of the patents comes with a good faith clause that says you can only use these if you use them in good faith, subject to these restrictions. You have to advance EV development. You can't sue Tesla over them and over errors with them. It's just pretty cool. But dude, what you were getting at, which I think is super interesting, and kind of the subject matter of this podcast, is IP as cultural infrastructure. Whereas, like, if as we shift from information economy to intellectual property economy, we also shift from information economy, just transmission of information through online chat forums and messengers and stuff, into cultural groups that are forming online. And a great example of that are the cultural movements around meme coins, which are kind of like culture coins, right? You have like Mog is a good example. That's a culture coin. You have this whole thesis by Murad of the various meme coins rated as cults, and the best ones being kind of the best cults. And those culture coins can be termed by another name intellectual property coins, because in many ways cultural property is intellectual property. And that's especially relevant when it comes to the indigenous tribes that we work with in SideDAO, where for them they have this very rich cultural property. The designs like you see behind me, the medicinal plants, their ethnic dress, all of these things that comprise the Shipibo culture, which are their cultural property, are not quite what we term in the West as intellectual property, because they haven't filed
Mm.
trademarks or filed patents on the medicinal plants, but they do have copyright, right? Like you said, it automatically vests in the creator. And they're starting to wake up to this idea that their cultural property is their intellectual property, and it can be a source of great wealth for them.
Yeah. I just want to double click on that a little bit more. Can you tell me a little bit more about this partnership with the Shipibo people and, how it came to be,
Mm-hmm.
what it is, and also how, like, what are the steps you're taking to sort of help them on their IP journey?
Yeah. Story time.
Story time. Give it to us.
So when I was in law school, I had a job offer to either go to a big law firm in New York City on Wall Street, or to a NGO in the Amazon rainforest to work on a project that I've been obsessed with for many years, which is the intellectual and physical property of the native peoples. So being a dumbass, I took the latter opportunity, didn't go to Wall Street to big law, and instead went into the heart of the Amazon rainforest surrounded by mosquitoes, and specifically focused on how to protect real property. How do we protect these lands from encroachment from oil companies and from loggers? And what are the rights that people have to prior consultation before their land gets logged or gets explored for oil? And how do I, as a lawyer, help to fight that in court? And what I found very quickly is that that is a fucking hard fight to fight. It's huge. It's multi-year, sometimes multi-decade litigation. You're going up against some of the most wealthy corporations on the planet on behalf of some of the poorest people on the planet. And so it's kind of like what Chris described with patent trolling. You do this calculation and you're like, shit, do we even have the multi-millions that it would take to fight this case for this real property and to protect it? And the answer that I quickly came to is no, you could fight that and it's a good fight. And I applaud and admire anybody who fights that fight because it's big, high stakes, real international litigation. But the people remain in poverty for the duration of it. Often the damages awards, if they ever come, are taken by many middlemen. Lawyers will often take 50% of the total damages award, and the actual trickle-down effect into the local economy of the tribes that were affected is very, very minimal because there's corruption at almost every level.
And would it be fair to
And
say
so,
it also can just rinse repeat somewhere else?
yeah,
And
yeah,
the fundamental
somewhere
system
else.
hasn't shifted at all.
Yeah, and so then I asked myself, well, then what is the greatest leverage vector that I can push on? What's the biggest lever here that I can push on for wealth creation at this tribal level? And I realized that that is the cultural property or the intellectual property of the tribe. Specifically, these patterns, like you see behind me, which are very recognizable throughout the world in anybody that has any association with or exposure to ayahuasca or ceremonial cultures or indigenous peoples, and their medicinal plants and their medicinal plant recipes, ultimately pharmaceutical drugs that can be very valuable intellectual property. And I thought that can actually be a much more easily protectable and scalable source of revenue for them. Not only do you not have to fight multi-year litigation against giant oil companies because you can just file a patent or file a copyright for much less, or not file a copyright, but register your pattern for much less. But also you can produce the work and sell it much more easily than you can produce goods on land and sell those goods, whether it's sequestered carbon or crops. And so I got super into it because I felt like this is the thing that I wanted to do as a lawyer. Is I wanted to make an impact on the protection and development, sustainable economic development of this indigenous tribe that had given me so much in terms of my magna cum laude degree because I studied them and wrote about them. And so I kind of extracted in a way their identity and their IP for my own benefit, right? Because I'm writing about it as a college student, and congrats, you get an award, and it's like, well, what did so you got your own personal accolades because of our work and our identity. It's like, yeah, you did. And so how do I give back? And it's in this protection of the IP. So that's how I got into it in law school, working down there in the Amazon, realizing that this beautiful art form exists and that not only is it scalable as a source of revenue for the tribe, but it's also widely stolen. For example, my wife had pillowcases that she bought from, Pier 1 or one of these other large companies that had these patterns on them. And that they're not paying royalties to the tribe, even though they're selling high volume of pillowcases with these patterns on them. And then you can look on Etsy or on stores that sell, festival gear, and they're selling t-shirts and pants with these Kene patterns on them.
Yeah, I mean, they're highly recognizable.
Yeah. And
You
they're
go to
also not
any sort of trans
paying
party and you'll
royalties.
see, at
Yeah,
least
you'll
a
see
dozen.
them,
Yeah.
but they're not paying royalties, and
Yeah.
they should be. Why? In part because it's the IP of those people, and because those people are living in extreme poverty. And so to me that's an injustice, and it's an injustice that we can remedy
Mm.
through intellectual property as cultural infrastructure, because this ethnicity is very, very widely recognized. They have a very distinct culture. It's a very rich culture, and a rich culture should translate into a rich people.
Yeah. So I'd
Yeah,
like to, like, what are you, can you describe your work that's happening with them now? Like, what are the things that you're putting into practice to sort of realize that this goal of yours?
Yep. So the first thing is the SideDAO Psych NFT memberships. Each one of those has a digitized version of one of these patterns, which are actually traditionally worn as skirts by the Shipibo women. They're about the size of a yoga mat. And so when a person purchases a Psych NFT, which represents a membership interest in SideDAO, they're purchasing a digitized version of one of these patterns, as well as the right to claim the physical piece of the pattern, as well as the smart contract power to mint prints. And those prints can then be sold as sub licenses to use the design for commercial products that could be used for whatever. And every time there's a sale, there's a royalty that is charged under the original licensing agreement. And so what we did was we purchased these patterns. We purchased them not only like everybody else does, which is a one-time purchase of the thing, and then they bring it home, and then maybe they resell it on their Etsy store, or they resell it at a festival, or they just put the pattern on a shirt. We purchased them specifically with an IP license. And we said, we're purchasing a right to use your pattern, and we'll pay you a royalty every single time there's a sale of a derivative work. Those NFTs, the Psych NFTs, are derivative works, right? Because we turned it into a digital image and then we sold that. So 20% of the sale price of the NFT is a royalty that is then paid to the original artist in the tribe. So that's one way we're doing it now. We're saying, here's your IP, we'll digitize it with the royalty right. Every time there's a sale, you'll get a percentage as a royalty. And for the Shipibo, it's completely novel. They're like, this is the first time we've ever been paid royalties. This is actually some of the first time we've ever even heard of the concept of intellectual property at all. We didn't know that we could sell this piece not only one time as a physical piece, but 1,000 times as a digital piece and get residual income from it in perpetuity. And so that's been a bit revolutionary on the ground level there. People are kind of excited. What is IP? Do we really have this IP? Are we sitting on a really valuable asset here that is just our culture? Which is super cool to see, because other tribes have done that. A great example is the Navajo in the US. They have a huge IP portfolio. Even in trademarks alone, they have something like 86 trademarks on the word Navajo and variations of the use of the word Navajo. And they sue. For example, they sued Urban Outfitters and Anthropology for selling products that were Navajo this, Navajo that. They sold a product, it was like a Navajo blanket, Navajo shirt. And the Navajo, because they own the trademark to the word Navajo, they were able to sue and win damages because Urban Outfitters wasn't allowed to sell products as Navajo this, Navajo that, using their trademark without paying them a licensing fee. And so the Shipibo are starting to wake up to that, which is cool.
yeah, yeah. I was just going to add to that. It does something important as well. I mean, for me, I think we're in a bad situation when the Navajo have to rely upon an intellectual property system that they didn't use before interaction with colonialism, in order to get any type of justice. So we're, I think, in Jesse and I chat about this with the Shipibo as well, and indigenous peoples around the world. We recognize too that this can be very good, and this is very good, but it's also still in many ways a foreign intervention, or can be perceived as such, and in some instances the mere act of how the system extracts the knowledge and then forces it to become public, once it's out there. Part of the way the IP system works too, say with patents, is that you have to disclose, you have to spill the beans in order to get the
Yeah.
patent. Now, this also doesn't work well with where you have to have a single inventor or individual inventors. We have a lot of different. Anyone who spends time in SideDAO will learn quickly that people have a lot of different means of understanding how knowledge is created. Is this something where it's me, an individual in the basement, alone with a light bulb, coming up with stuff, or am I a conduit? Am I just flesh and bones getting trained, and then sort of being a conduit for a lot of energies that we collectively create, and sometimes, flourish into something that crystallizes into a patent that I happen to. If you, songwriters will talk about this. You kind of write songs, but a lot of times, if you write a really good song, you don't feel like you wrote it. You're sort of like, oh, I grabbed that one out of the ether, and I'm glad I was the one to hear it and put it down. And those who approach creativity and art this way, the IP system as it exists just does not have anything for you. It tells you that's not, we don't consider that anything. And this is the position that Indigenous peoples have been in for 40 years, where, as Jesse was saying, a lot maybe don't know about IP because it's kind of a foreign and somewhat of an odd concept, to make exclusive something that's intangible. But others who do have had experiences where they say, well, this is our traditional cultural knowledge, or this is knowledge that's been around for centuries. And so we want protection on it. And then the Western IP system comes, really a European IP system comes and says, well, it's been around for too long. So some might argue, well, let's say that Kenne design, this works with Kenne because each Kenne is a unique drawing. So there's a different pattern every time. Well, what if for, this a bad what if, but you can imagine what if there was always, I mean, there's an image and likeness that's similar, right? Or what if there was it always looked the same, but it was in the process of it being made where the culture came through. Well, if it always looked the same, we would get into a problem with copyright, such that that tribe would no longer be able to protect that thing after the life of the author plus 70 years or something, or in this instance, it would have already been in the public domain. So with this too, what we're doing, I think we're creating a bridge, a scaffolding for Indigenous communities to operate in a way that's beneficial to them and that still provides them with autonomy and power and control. They get to veto a use if we were to try and sell a derivative work of a psych in a way that offended the Shipibo. Under the license, they could say, no, you're not allowed. And we honor that then. What we're also in the process of building when you go down these network effect sides is to say, let's also figure out if we can embrace and care for perhaps a completely alternative IP system. Maybe it's not even IP as we know it. Maybe there's a sacred knowledge transmission thing that culturally might happen among a group of people, but we're going to voluntarily accept a duty of care, a just broad sense of saying, we respect this and we're going to honor what this means on its own terms. And part of what we're building unlocks this with Indigenous peoples as well, so that we're actually creating fertile ground to maybe improve IP so it can, again, speak to people who want to use it on their terms rather than having them have to conform to the terms that are currently written.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things I found about like DeSci and intellectual property tokens in general is that I think off the bat one would sort of assume that intellectual property is kind of inherently individualistic. Like it's kind of going like, I'm drawing a line in the sand, this is mine, it belongs to me. And then you have like on the complete like contrary is the really deeply community-based aspect of decentralized science and DAOs and all of this. And I think, I mean, I think honestly, if you're any human with a brain and a heart, you also understand that like collective effort is completely necessary for any form of progress, let alone acceleration, which I think a lot of people are, aiming for. So I think one of the nice things that sort of posed buy the intellectual property tokens is these like membership agreements where you have sort of a bunch of people that are all joining and like sort of partaking in this intellectual property rather than this more
Mm-hmm.
individualistic approach.
Yep. It kind of like corporations, right? A corporation is a person, and a corporation often owns all the IP produced by the employees of the corporation. And that means that that IP is actually collectively governed, right? It's not necessarily collectively owned, it's owned by the corporation. But all of the people in the corporation are contributing to it. They're helping to govern it, they're helping to develop it. Similarly, you could look at IP tokens as this network formed around this IP, where it's collectively governed, even though there's a single owner, the owner of the IP NFT, there is this collective gathered around it. And I think that that's very, very important to realize that collective ownership or collective governance of IP is not new because it not only exists in the corporate context, but it also exists in the tribal context.
Mm.
Yeah, and I've been really digging into this history and the cultural origins of the modern system and grappling with how it interacts with even myself. And you're so right, Ella. It's there's a very clearly identifiable English culture. I mean, like from England, in the modern IP system and its evolution, and that kind of sense of liberalism in the meaning of individual self, and the labor that's been used to create and sort of form an IP system and its justifications come a lot out of John Locke, and you can, I mean, there's other continental philosophy that's gone into copyright and the like, but in a lot of ways you can see, especially in the US system, which is the one where I was trained, the English influence and its approach to property and the automatic assumption of exclusivity and things like this. And English common law then plays a role. Now, interestingly enough, Irish common, the Brehon law, before English common law, was it is one of the best documented, robust systems that Europe had recorded. And Breton law is focused on having essentially a voluntaristic, much more horizontal kind of, anarchic federation type style of conflict transformation where there are no police, there are no jail, there's no death penalty, these types of things. Property, what about 90% of what you would look out when you look across Ireland would be common property, and there'd be very few pieces that were sort of private property in the sense that we think of today. This system and this logic, I think I'm actively exploring now and chatting with a few experts on Breton law, for how it actually might provide us with yet another system we can add. The
Mm.
English system has done really well in helping guide us through as it's gone because the system it's a complete system in its own right, but it does very poorly with common property. Whereas I think the Breton law system may end up being something that I'm interested in trying to bring further into the protocol development as a means for the next layer that we need to build in all of this is a dispute resolution layer. Um, as we mentioned, the problems are the lawsuits. We haven't solved that with our protocols yet. And to solve it, we need to have the lawsuits happen in
Mm.
protocol before having to go to the courts. And so using a meaningful dispute resolution system that currently we've built on top of common law principles, but I think the next step is to actually organize lawyers, mediators,
Mm.
arbitrators who can do this. And in that vein, actually, I'm planning to explore Breton law as a potential framework, that we can use. I mentioned this too, and why this is nice because in instances where Breton law has ever appeared inside European, or really the U.S. system and elsewhere, it's been raised by indigenous peoples from the Western Hemisphere as saying the Breton law principles are the closest thing that we have to how we would handle these things in court. And that again, I think comes from it being a system that evolved out of tribes to
Yeah.
a like clans essentially. But
Interesting.
DAOs are perfect for this.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think we're gonna have to change the name of the podcast from IP as cultural infrastructure to really culture determining IP infrastructure. Sort of. But yeah. Okay. I think that's all we have time for today. It's been so great chatting to you both. I think it's been really interesting, and I think it's really important to sort of understand the thought processes and the moral beliefs that drive the IP systems that we are trying to set up. I think, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is revolutionize how intellectual property is dealt with and traded and related to, and that can't be done before people understand the value and the mechanics of intellectual property, which, yeah, I think can be rather unapproachable, but obviously whenever I chat to you guys, it becomes a lot more approachable. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ella.
Yeah, thank you, Ella.
Awesome. Okay, have a beautiful day.
You too.